I'm Christina Cameli. I'm a free motion quilting author and teacher, and I'm here to talk to you today about choosing quilting designs for your quilt. When I go over this with students in my class, the thing I like to ask first is, what's the favorite thing about your quilt? What's the best thing about this quilt for you? And sometimes that's a fabric, sometimes it's a color, a particular shape, or just an area of the quilt. And if you have something like that in the quilt you're looking to finish, then start there. We think of ways that we can emphasize the things that you like best about your quilt. One of the best ways that you can emphasize something is by leaving it unquilted. So here I have a little example. In this block, I just quilted everything equally. It's all pressed down the same way. But in the second block, I've chosen this fuchsia color to leave unquilted. And hopefully you can see this in person. The fuchsia really lifts off of the fabric and grabs your attention first. It takes my eye another couple of seconds to even notice that there's this blue triangle right here. So leaving something unquilted is a way to get the viewer's attention first. Now you may have areas of your quilt that are too big to leave completely unquilted, and that's fine too. That's the situation that I had with this quilt here. I had these long ribbons of color that I wanted to emphasize, and I wanted the white to sort of recede into the background. So there I just decided to use a less dense quilting pattern on the stuff that I wanted to emphasize. So it's really open, and I wasn't afraid to leave some bigger areas here so that it poofs up a little bit and it becomes the foreground of the quilt. And then with the white, I quilted it pretty densely, and that smushes down and becomes the background. There's other ways to increase focus on a particular area of your quilt. Anytime you stitch several times around a shape, echoing it, you give a visual reverberation to the area. It kind of underlines that part, whatever you've echoed, and it pulls the viewer's eye in there. And so here I've done both, leaving something unquilted and echoing around it. Another way to pull the viewer's eye somewhere is to have a bunch of lines that radiate out from a center point. So here I'm pulling a lot of focus on that star because all of these lines on the outside are leading in right to the star. So after we've thought about areas we want to emphasize, then you can turn your attention to what motifs might you use. And I always value the quilter's instinct on this one. If there's something that's coming to your mind, let's start there and start playing with it. For me, one of the things that comes to my mind first is pebbles. But pebbles take a long time. If you're going to cover a whole quilt in pebbles, they take a long time to quilt. And for me, I get a little bored of just doing pebbles. So I like to think of ways that I can use that motif a little differently. So here's one way that I've come up with. I've got a lot of the fun of pebbles, of just having them in these lines, but they're also interspersed with these wavy lines to give it a little bit of variety and to make the quilting go a little bit faster. Now, if you need help coming up with motifs, one thing you might do is look to your fabrics if you're using print fabrics. Here I've got a fabric and the quilting design that came out of it. And you might have inspiration like this all throughout your quilt. And if you do, this is a great way to find motifs that are already working with the quilt itself and just lift them up into the quilting design. So here is a piece of patchwork. And I've got some quilting designs that it inspired. This fabric leads me to this leafy vine. These little circles on the strings give me this kind of a pattern. I'm getting this great orange peel pattern off of this fabric right here. And then these little orange beads made me think of this design. And of all of them that I came up with from this piece of patchwork, I think this one is my favorite, and I'll tell you why. If you're a new quilter, it may be a little challenging for you to think of how you move around the quilt and make sure to cover all the space without getting stuck in a corner or leaving something unquilted. So what I like about this design is it starts at one end of the piece and it goes all the way to the other. So you kind of know which direction you're going. You start at one end and you just keep quilting in that direction. You don't have a lot of decisions to make. So I want to show you how I'm going to stitch this so that you could try it at home if you want. I'm going to start at the bottom of my piece, And my reason for that is right now there's nothing to match. This pattern I'm going to try and match one side to the other roughly, and I want to be stitching my first half out into the open space. It can be a little hard to see behind the free motion foot, so anytime you know that there's blank space behind you, that's a great way to start out. And then I'm going to come back down the other side, and it'll be easier for me to see the points that I'm trying to match then. Okay, so let's try this design. I've got my needle lined back up with where I pulled the bobbin thread up, and I'm going to take a couple of locking stitches there. Although if I were starting at the edge of the quilt, I wouldn't need to do that. And I've given myself here a little guiding line, just written lightly in white pencil. We'll see if I can follow that. It's behind the free motion foot, so it may make it a little challenging. I'm just going to go with these little half circle arcs. Now my stitching has kind of gotten out of this little shape that I have in my hands, what I call the U shape. So I'm going to stop there and reposition my hands. The needle was down in the fabric, so it doesn't shift when I do that. And start again. And I'm making sure that some of them are smaller and some of them are bigger. And I'll reposition my hands again. And now here I'm at the top, I'm going to come back down the other side. And I'm not worrying too much about hitting the line exactly. I'm giving a little space between one edge and the other, so I've got some wiggle room there. Reposition again. And there you go. When you start the next line, you could draw yourself a new guiding line, or you could just start to work with the spacing that you have. All right, so let me show you a few more things. Another thing to keep in mind when you're choosing your quilting designs is, do you want your quilting designs to go over the seams of your patchwork, or do you want to keep the designs within the seams of your patchwork? And here's how I like to think of that. If my patchwork says really everything I want to say in that quilt, then I generally will keep the quilting within the seam lines of the patchwork, so that I'm just emphasizing what the patchwork is already saying. So that's kind of the approach that I took with the quilt on the wall over here. For me, that quilt is about the optical illusion of the overlapping squares, and I didn't want any overlapping quilting over those seam lines to muddy that. But sometimes the situation calls for an overall design, and that's fine too. On this quilt right here, I ended up, once I was done piecing the top, I ended up feeling a little underwhelmed with the range of fabrics, the color values in it, and I knew that I wanted the quilting to add to the quilt so that the quilt had a little bit more to say. And so in that case, I chose this all-over design that didn't as much emphasize the piecing as it did sort of make big spaces, open spaces for these quilting designs to come through. This is another edge-to-edge design, and a really good one for new quilters to try. So once you've thought about all these questions about what might work for your quilt, I would advise that you don't go directly to quilting, but that you take a little time with pen and paper to make sure that you like the decisions that you're making, and that you feel ready to take the designs through your quilt. So how I do that is I take a photo of my quilt, and I'll try and just get a small piece of the quilt so I can see at the level of the quilting design how things are going to work. Usually I'll increase the brightness on the color if you have a program that can do that, or decrease the opacity, which would make the image more transparent, so it's easier to draw even on the darker colors. And print it out a few times so that you can give yourself some ideas. On this quilt, I decided that what I'd really like to do would be to emphasize these big colors, so I gave it I quilted down the middle. I thought about quilting down the middle and quilting down the background there, but thought about different ways to do it in the different wheels. So Take these ideas, make them your own, trust your own instincts. This has been Picking Quilting Designs.